A controversial American Christian performer has sparked debate in Canada over where we draw the line on free speech, plus the aftermath of last week's acquittals in the Hockey Canada sexual assault trial. All that and more straight ahead on episode 20 of the Rob Breakenridge Show.
The last 2 days, worship being stopped in Canada, being silenced, being fined, being attacked by Antifa, being canceled. This has been like the number one story in the world, trending around the world. This kind of publicity you can't make happen. You can't conjure it up. You can't buy it. It just happened.
Well, I believe they call that the Streisand effect. Well, hello, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. That was the voice of Sean Feucht, who I must confess I had not heard of until last week. That was from a video he posted to social media as he headed back to the United States after 3 shows on the weekend in Canada. Sean Feucht is an American Christian singer. That's probably insufficient in adequately describing who he is. He's very much a conservative American Christian, a Christian nationalist by his own admission, and he's closely aligned with what we refer to as the MAGA movement in the United States. So he's not everyone's cup of tea, but who is, really? This is not the first time Feucht has visited Canada, but as far as I can recall, it's the first time it's led to this much controversy. Perhaps that's related to just a general sense of dismay or opposition to Trump himself 6 months into his second term. Maybe there are other factors. Whatever the case, it's given Sean Feucht a huge amount of notoriety and publicity, and it's prompted quite a conversation about free speech in this country. I've got a piece up on all of this at our website. You can read that at robbreakenridge.ca. And I think there is a connection to some upcoming performances in Canada by an Irish hip-hop group called Kneecap. They're controversial, but for very different reasons. As for Sean Feucht, things escalated pretty quickly in the lead-up to this past weekend. A number of Canadian venues canceled scheduled performances, leaving organizers scrambling to find alternative venues. Now, Feucht did end up performing over the weekend in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa, but not without some further drama. Police and protesters were on hand in Montreal Friday night at the church where Feucht ended up performing. Now, even though the venue was a church, Montreal officials still tried to stop the show from happening and have now levied a fine against the church for hosting the performance. The spokesman for Montreal's mayor said, quote, "This show runs counter to the values of inclusion, solidarity, and respect that are championed in Montreal. Freedom of expression is one of our fundamental values, but hateful and discriminatory speech is not acceptable in Montreal." Now look, disagreeing with a performer's political or religious views shouldn't be the standard for whether a show is allowed to even happen. The mayor can certainly champion all of those values, and they're values worth aspiring to, but not sharing those values is not a crime. If there's no law being violated, there's no reason why officials should shut down the performance. The Canadian Constitution Foundation has been following developments here, and they're very concerned about what's happened, including and especially the response from officials in Montreal. Joining us now for more is Christine Van Geyn, litigation director for the Canadian Constitution Foundation. More at their website, theccf.ca. Christine, thanks so much for joining us here.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I guess at the end of it all, I mean, this singer did perform 3 times in Canada over the weekend, but between the other cancellations, now a church in Montreal facing fines, I guess there's enough still to be concerned about here.
Yeah, my big concern is the revocation of the permits, which seem to be on the basis of the content of the speech, or even not even the content of the music. I don't think that's what's an issue. I think the issue is other statements that he's made, on his website that people just don't like. That's not grounds for revoking a permit to perform in a park. The permits were revoked ostensibly for public safety reasons at a number of these. That's a difficult decision to review, but I have not seen, the rationale for that. It doesn't look like there were actually going to be, for example, violent protests that were going to be out of control that required the permits to be canceled. The bigger concern, though, is what happened in Montreal at the church that stepped in to host him at the last minute. This church invited the singer to perform a worship service inside the church. This artist played worship music. It didn't look like they had any equipment that's outside the norm for what a church service would include. And it looks from the outside like the mayor had asked this concert not to take place. So the police went ahead and issued a ticket saying that the church didn't have a permit to have that concert take place. You don't need a permit to have a church service. It looks like political targeting of this particular performer on the basis of the content of not even his music, but his general political beliefs. And that is not justified in a free and democratic society where we have constitutional protections for freedom of religion and expression.
And it's important to note, I mean, obviously Sean Feucht is American and he's come to this country as a guest. I mean, charter rights still do apply to people who are visiting this country, but I guess at the same time too, we also need to remember there were those who invited him to perform. There were those who want to see him perform. So these are all Canadians we're talking about. I guess we got to think of their charter rights.
Of course. I mean, people want to see him perform, and more people want to see him perform now that there's been this attempt to silence him. I think no one would even be having this conversation most people wouldn't even know who this individual is if there hadn't been these attempts to censor his speech. And it's a classic example of turning someone into a martyr, turning this classic Streisand effect. The more you try to tell someone not to listen to something, the more they're going to pay attention to it.
The question of issuing permits for events, I mean, if we're talking about some kind of public space that's shared or is potentially available to the public, maybe there's a matter for municipalities to have some sort of system. But as you say, this situation in Montreal, it was a church that is designed by its very nature to hold people, to have events, to have people singing or speaking on a stage. On what basis would a municipality claim that they would need a permit for something there?
Yeah, so it's not clear. There is not a lot of public information about the fine that was issued. My understanding is the church has not actually even received the fine. I spoke to them yesterday. What I have come to sort of understand, like what I have pieced together, is it seems like the city will be issuing a fine for the church failing to get a special event permit. Now, this is a permit that takes 10 days to apply for and get approved. And that was not going to be possible in this situation where this individual had his permit from the city revoked. There wasn't good at the last minute. This church stepped in and offered to host him. But putting that aside, the fact is that this is a worship service. From what it looks like to me, this man plays worship music. It's not necessarily a concert. There's no charge to attend. It's available to all inside a church using equipment that seems standard at any church. So I don't think a permit should have to be required for something like that, even if the city wants to claim that this special event permit is required. In these circumstances, first of all, I don't think they should have to require that permit, even if it had been a concert. But second of all, I think that this is just standard use of the church for a religious purpose.
When it comes to political views, it is interesting to note, as you said, that it's not an issue of the songs that this singer performs. It's views that he has expressed in other venues. So it's not even clear or obvious that in this concert or any other concert he's going to repeat those views. Now, we can talk about whether they cross any kind of line in and of themselves, but for any sort of controversial speaker or singer or event, how do we judge, I guess, the merits of these things or whether there's any basis for governments to intervene?
So speech is protected in Canada. The only time you can really impose a content-based restriction is when the high standards in the criminal law on prohibitions to hate speech are triggered. And that is a really, really high standard. To constitute hate speech, you would need to have speech that is the most, these are in the words of the Supreme Court, the most extreme manifestation of the emotion described by the words detestation and vilification that risks causing discriminatory or other harmful effects, or where it forces certain people to argue for their basic humanity. Now, I don't think anything that this performer said on his website rises to that standard. I admit I haven't seen everything he said, but what has been, I'm pretty sure if he had said something that met that standard, CBC would have reported it. I've not seen anything that rose to that standard. And it's just sort of a classic issue, isn't it? That we have a foreign performer who wants to come to Canada with controversial music. This kind of fight has existed my entire life. I'm sure it's existed your whole life. People wouldn't want, Ozzy Osbourne performing. People wouldn't want Eminem performing. Their lyrics are too controversial. Now it's just a different type of speech that's trying to be censored. And in classic fashion, artists benefit from this type of behavior. So if you wanted to shine a spotlight and have everyone know who Sean Feucht is, congratulations to all of the people who tried to silence him. Now we're talking about him.
Yeah, he's definitely benefiting from this notoriety for sure. There was the question, I guess, of admissibility into Canada, which is sort of a separate issue. It's a little more arbitrary. I know there's this Irish group, Kneecap, that some want to see, denied entry into Canada for various reasons, right? And I think one of their members is facing a criminal charge in the UK. So those matters become a little different, the arbitrariness of whether someone's admissible for entry into Canada. But I guess the point is, once someone is allowed into the country, then it's simply a matter of, okay, well, we expect you to follow the laws. And if you do them, then we shouldn't have an issue.
It doesn't seem like that's an issue in this particular case with Sean Feucht. It doesn't seem like has been any issue on his ability to enter the country. It was only the issuing of these permits. And look, I would be a hypocrite if I said we shouldn't allow Kneecap to perform here either. Even though I think that the statements that Kneecap, this Irish-based hip hop group that has, said horrific things like "kill your MP" and I think "death to the IDF" and waved a Hezbollah flag. I mean, I find all of that abhorrent and disgusting. But I don't think that we should prohibit them from performing. We should counter speech that we don't like with better speech. We should not amplify their message by trying to turn them into martyrs by censoring them. If you don't like a particular performance, you have the right to freedom of expression and assembly. You can go and protest.
Now, as it pertains to Sean Feucht, he did these 3 shows in Canada over the weekend. I think he's back in the United States now, but will be returning to Canada later this summer for 3 more shows. What should we be watching for? And do you expect that any of this is going to end up in court?
So interestingly, I think that the Montreal issue will end up in court. I think the issue of this fine will end up in court unless the city decides not to issue it or to withdraw it. That will end up in court. I don't know if Mr. Feucht is planning on challenging the revocation of the permits. That is harder to challenge because it's what we call an administrative decision. It's reviewed on a standard of reasonableness, and that's a really deferential standard. So if the decision maker at, for example, Parks Canada says we had legitimate concerns about safety at this event, that's a difficult hurdle to overcome. They would have to demonstrate that they had those concerns, but if they have any evidence to support it, the courts are quite deferential to that. The most likely at succeeding is to challenge to the fine, if that ever does actually get issued. What to watch for in the fall? I actually think that this issue might go away just because I live about 10 minutes from where Mr. Feucht performed last night. So I drove past last night to see, what was going on. There were no protests. It was a very run-of-the-mill event. It was a lot more people than I think he would otherwise have attracted, but just regular folks just lining up quietly, peacefully to get inside a church to watch a concert. I think if this had not been turned into the big brouhaha that it has been, there wouldn't, if there hadn't been the attempt to cancel him, there wouldn't be all of this attention. So I don't think there's going to be a big issue in the fall unless the people who hate this man continue to make it an issue.
But you mentioned Parks Canada, interesting, because I think if these shows had gone ahead, it's not as though Parks Canada is endorsing this performer. Like if a venue is open for the public to rent or to use, like does there need to be a high bar for, whether Parks Canada is going to step in and say, no, you can't use this?
No, I think that it shouldn't be a content-based bar. It shouldn't depend on the content of the the performance. It shouldn't be up to Parks Canada to say, I like this performer, so I'm going to allow it, and I don't like that performer's music, or his particular views, so I won't allow it. Safety is often also used as a pretext for disallowing something that the government just dislikes. So I'm skeptical of government claims about that this was really a safety issue, especially in light of the fact that many other municipalities, the politicians in those municipalities said that this was about the content, Montreal in particular.
We'll see where it all goes from here. Much more, as mentioned, the ccf.ca. Christine, appreciate your insight on all this. Thanks so much for joining us here.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, once again, that is Christine Van Geyn, litigation director with the Canadian Constitution Foundation, more at their website, theccf.ca. So as mentioned, Sean Feucht is scheduled to return to Canada at some point soon here to do these other 3 concert dates. One of them, by the way, is scheduled for the Alberta legislature. So there's been some pressure on the Alberta government to step in and cancel this performance. Look, I doubt that's going to happen, a cancellation that is, and honestly, that's probably the right decision. What is going to be interesting, though, I guess, to see is whether members of the UCP government or the UCP caucus show up at this concert or are involved in any way, maybe posing for pictures or meeting with Sean Feucht, that sort of thing. But again, I think it's similar to what we see elsewhere. I mean, if people want to see this, then they should have the opportunity to put this together if these spaces are available to them. If no law is being broken here, I'm not sure there's a case really to intervene. Now, I guess if people want to draw attention to this, you can protest or raise concern about all of this. But, as I mentioned earlier, like previously when this guy had come to Canada, there was really no controversy. I don't think anybody had heard of him. So this notoriety, this publicity, I think is definitely playing into his hands, which is we referred to a couple of times as often called the Streisand effect. And I think we're seeing at play here. But at the same time, too, I think there's a need for some principle here. And so will we see some of these roles reversed once we get into later this year when the Irish hip-hop group Kneecap is scheduled to perform in Toronto and Vancouver as part of their tour? There's been some controversy recently regarding this group, some comments they've made about the conflict in the Middle East. There are those that are saying the Canadian government shouldn't allow them to enter the country. So more background on all of that. And this whole controversy, too, regarding Sean Feucht, at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. Coming up in just a moment here, we're going to talk about the fallout from the verdicts last week in the Hockey Canada sexual assault trial. 5 members of the 2018 Team Canada World Junior Team were acquitted last week of sexual assault stemming back to an incident that occurred in a hotel room in 2018. You might also recall when this story first emerged, it was about Hockey Canada's handling of all of this, a lawsuit that had been settled, a payout that had been made from what turned out to be kind of a secret slush fund that Hockey Canada had, which seemed designed to deal with these kinds of matters. So it was quite a pushback against how Hockey Canada was dealing with these matters. You might recall, there was a bunch of big sponsors that wanted nothing to do with Hockey Canada. And then that kind of settled. Those sponsors started to return. And once these charges were laid and the trial began, it became very much about these players as opposed to Hockey Canada. So where are we at now? That the trial has ended, the verdicts have come down, and those are not guilty verdicts. Is that the end of the story? Where does this go from here? Writer Scott Stinson is going to be with us. He's got a great piece up at The Line, readtheline.ca. You can check that out. But we'll get into that coming up with Scott Stinson in just a second here. You're listening to The Rob Breakenridge Show. Joining us for more on the aftermath of last week's acquittal of these 5 former members of the World Junior Team Canada 2018, and where this whole story goes from here, what it all means for Hockey Canada. Very pleased to welcome to the program Scott Stinson. He's a Toronto-based writer and journalist. He's got a piece up at readtheline.ca on all of this and much more at his Substack, scottstinson.substack.com. Scott, so great to have you with us here.
Thanks so much for having me on, Rob.
It's interesting. When we look back to this whole story blew up and the controversy that engulfed Hockey Canada, when we look at this trial and the verdicts last week, I mean, at some point did Hockey Canada almost become detached from this? Like it became more about the players than how the organization handled this?
Yeah, I think I think in the early days when, really in 2022, when this was blowing up as a media story after the lawsuit that was quickly settled was filed, I think we all kind of thought this was a very much a story about Hockey Canada's response and what they did or didn't do. Really, the culture of hockey was a big talking point. The whole junior hockey system of Canada was a big talking point. And then I think as we got into what became the criminal trial, it became evident relatively quickly that in the context of a criminal court, all that other stuff was not a factor anymore, and it became very much a sexual assault trial, and started dealing with all the things that those trials and prosecutions and it's a very difficult crime in terms of evidence and nuances and all this stuff. So it became like a much more narrower thing, I think, ultimately than a lot of us expected it to be.
Right. And the fact that these five were acquitted, does that in any way vindicate Hockey Canada's handling of all of this, or might some see it that way? How do we connect the two, do you think?
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that some people are going to say that Hockey Canada was vindicated in a manner of speaking, in the fact that they didn't do much of anything in 2018. I mean, the way I kind of was, even as in 2022 looking at this story, was that it seemed when the now former Hockey Canada executives were explaining themselves, they were kind of saying that when the allegations were first brought forward in 2018, that they looked into it, but the complainant at the time didn't want to pursue it any further. And then they just kind of let it fall by the wayside. The investigation, their internal investigation, was closed. They never even identified the alleged players who were involved. There was no punishment on the players, even from a you're no longer going to represent Hockey Canada kind of thing. Like, there was nothing happened in 2018. And then I think when it was all kind of blowing up in 2022, there was a moment in time after the stuff started getting really negative for Hockey Canada that they kind of changed their tune a little. They had hired a crisis management PR firm, and they started pushing back a little. And they never said this overtly, but I always wondered at the time, Rob, if it was a case of like, they sort of wanted to say, look, like, we actually don't necessarily think we did everything wrong. We heard this young lady's complaints, and ultimately we chose not to act on them. And at the time, I think they would never have admitted that on the record, because they had just paid out a settlement. So those two things couldn't really sit next to one another. So instead, they kind of went, oh, we should have taken this more seriously in 2018, and we regret not doing, taking it any further, and so on and so forth. And then now that this legal trial has come to an end, I think there's a bit of a wanting to wind back and go, see, this is why they didn't do anything in 2018. So I think some people will see it that way. I all along felt like the big problem was that they didn't do enough in 2018. It always seemed odd that they started an investigation into what were very, very serious allegations, and then just didn't do anything further when it became apparent that the woman at the center of it wasn't going to do anything. And to my mind, that was their big failing as an institution. And they've had their whole leadership change at this point now anyway. So that reckoning, such as it was, has already happened.
Right, because there's still a whole matter of how this case was settled, or what we learned at the time, right, was the existence of this fund that we didn't know about previously that was kind of used to deal with these sorts of cases. Like, it doesn't change, I guess, how that was handled.
Absolutely not. And the fact, one of the things that has happened in the wake of the leadership changes at Hockey Canada is greater transparency in the way their money is spent, the funds that are allocated. I'm pretty sure that the name of the fund, Rob, was something like the National Equity Fund, which is like a very Seinfeldian sort of name that you give to some fund that doesn't have any real obvious purpose other than some money that we can dole out as we see fit. And so, the existence of things like that were properly criticized, and there was effectively punishment given out because of those things. People lost their jobs, sponsors pulled out their money and then eventually put it back in. So I think that a lot of the things that were raised 3 years ago were still valid, regardless of what happened with the criminal trial. And some of the changes that were made will obviously not be rolled back now that this has happened. I mean, they're pretty comfortable, they being Hockey Canada, with their governance now, and they feel like they've solved that. If nothing else, this case did force them to sort of tidy up some of the way they do business.
To what extent do you think all of this speaks to the whole issue of culture? And I think maybe that in part involves the idea that Hockey Canada is there to protect the players or protect the program above all, and clean up these messes where they occur. But still you get this idea of sort of entitled players, or players who almost feel like they're somewhat invincible when it comes to these sorts of things, those more troubling aspects that I don't know if this case, the criminal trial, necessarily even really dealt with.
Yeah, look, that's something that I think I think a lot of people hoped would perhaps be altered by this. This idea. I don't think it's being unfair to say, look, there's always been criticism that, especially in like small towns, the hockey players who are big stars can have what seems like a sense of entitlement. Guys who are on the World Junior team and are on potentially a pathway to becoming NHL millionaires probably feel much the same way. Again, I don't think that's being unfair for everyone to acknowledge that this is a thing that has happened over the decades. And I think the fact that this trial ended the way it did, not just with not guilty verdicts, but with the judge like fairly, aggressively discounting the evidence that the complainant gave, I think that's going to maybe cause, there's certainly potential for people to say, see, it was just boys being boys and everything's fine. And to the extent that that is the way some people interpret it, it's presumably, I would think, pretty obviously a step backwards for, the way the discussions were going. But I've also heard from people, I will say, Rob, in doing some reporting on this subject over the last little while, that there are people who sort of acknowledge that, look, like, even the defendant's best version of the events of that 2018 night is pretty grim. And that if you're a potential star hockey player, you probably do not want to be involved in situations like that. And in fact, even in that one situation, we've now heard of multiple players who, were part of that same group chat and were invited to the hotel room and either didn't go or went there and immediately turned around and left and said, this is not something I think I should be a part of. So, hopefully there's been a bit of a lesson learned there somewhere, but I also do think that the way the verdict ended up, it's probably fewer people will take that lesson than might have otherwise.
And does the story kind of end there, I guess, Scott? I mean, do you expect to see any sort of shift in focus back to Hockey Canada, or is that, do you think?
I think it's pretty much that. I don't see at this point what the shift back towards Hockey Canada is, unless it's people saying that they were unfair to the men who became the criminal defendants by settling that lawsuit quickly and effectively on their behalf, which, legally, we in the media, the public, shouldn't have necessarily taken the fact that a lawsuit was quickly settled as an admission of guilt. Of course, right. We don't know that it was, but it certainly kind of put a certain spin, I think, on that story pretty quickly. And I'm sure the defendants, the men who became the defendants, felt that it didn't help them that they were suddenly, that Hockey Canada was rushing as fast as it could to apologize and to reach some sort of quick settlement and to acknowledge that mistakes had been made 4 years earlier. I mean, that definitely influenced, I think, what ultimately became a criminal case. So there might be some reckoning for Hockey Canada in that sense. But again, those guys, the people who made those decisions, aren't there anymore. So even having said this to you now, I kind of doubt that there'll be too much to happen. I think mostly Hockey Canada is going to be business as usual going forward.
Yeah, and that was evident a while ago. I think, as you say, when sponsors started coming back, that was kind of that, and people were going to move on. Hockey Canada is still a very, very powerful entity. The system that exists, the system that it oversees, is as strong as ever. And it's interesting too because this isn't necessarily an NHL story, even though these players had made it to the NHL. I mean, this is a story about Hockey Canada, the World Junior team, this whole system. But the NHL benefits from that system, right? So how much was this also an NHL story, do you think?
Well, look, in the height of the sort of controversy, I wondered if we were dealing with will this be one of the things that brings down what we see as the junior hockey system in Canada and right. to a lesser extent the United States? I mean, it is a unusual situation in that there are, players, teenage prospects are drafted into a team in the region where they live. It is usually not a team that is close to home. They then have to go play as teenagers for very little money before they are drafted into the NHL. This system has been the subject of many court challenges. There was recently a big class action suit in the States that ended up not going anywhere. Lots of people have challenged whether junior hockey is exploitive of these young players. And the NHL is the direct beneficiary of that system, right? Like they do not have a farm system the way that Major League Baseball does, for example. These teams do not have to pay these guys to develop in their young years. It's not until they're professionals that they get drafted and then the NHL takes over. So the NHL definitely benefits from the system as it stands. And to the extent that there might have been some, major tent poles getting knocked over, when this case was at its most controversial, I think all of that goes away now, and the system exists. There's been some changes to it, with the NCAA and money to be made there and those kind of things like these. There's been other challenges to junior hockey, and I think the system's going to change over the next few years, but not in the way it might have, and certainly not in a way that might have directly impacted the NHL.
Yeah. Now, there's the question, I guess, of the future of these players, right? As far as pertains to the NHL, the league is saying, hang on, not so fast. We still got to decide how to deal with these guys. The NHLPA says, they're acquitted. They're not guilty. They should be able to resume their careers. This is going to be delicate, isn't it?
It is for sure. And I'm not sure what position the league is going to be able to hold on to say these players don't have a right to resume their careers. I mean, if they are going to, the standard is basically somebody is accused of poor behavior, they get investigated, the league makes a decision, they might issue a suspension, something like that. But because of the way this all went down, these players have effectively been under suspension for a couple of years now anyway. So it seems like they have all paid some sort of price, despite the fact that the criminal trial that ended in acquittals. They all lost their jobs for a certain period of time. It just seems like a precedent that I can't imagine the league is going to try to carve out for this one specific set of men to have a standard that probably wouldn't apply to anybody else who plays in the league. So I guess I'm not surprised that the NHL's first reaction would be like, hold on a second, we're not just going to reinstate them all instantly. But I can't imagine that this will go on, endlessly or indefinitely without them being able to resume professional careers and potentially in the NHL. Now, whether an NHL team wants to take chances on these guys, given what's been in the public record related to this trial, I don't know. But it seems like it would be a tough sell for the NHL over the long term to just keep them out based on the allegations that were raised in court.
Yeah, I mean, it's unrelated to this case. Of course, the NHL just went through the whole reckoning with the Kyle Beach affair and the Chicago Blackhawks, and Stan Bowman's back in the league. Joel Quenneville's back in the league. So the NHL has just kind of been through their own sort of related controversy on this, I guess. And maybe that's why they're reluctant to at this point, welcome back these players. But, they got to make a decision at some point. And maybe they've already set the precedent that you can be forgiven. There is a way back, right?
Sure. Yeah. And again, that's a good point about Quenneville and Bowman. And if you look at these guys, they haven't had a formal suspension by the NHL over them. but they've also effectively, as I said earlier, been out of the game for an extended period of time now. So if you're going to do and again, in the Bowman and Quenneville cases, like both those men admitted to making mistakes in the Kyle Beach case, right, and they acknowledged wrongdoing and they said they should have done better. And in the case of the defendants in the Hockey Canada, the most recent Hockey Canada trial, they never acknowledged wrongdoing, and I don't mean that as like they should have. I'm just saying that because they haven't admitted guilt and shown remorse and those kind of things, it seems to me even harder for the NHL to impose punishment on them when they've not particularly admitted any wrongdoing.
We'll see where it all goes from here. As mentioned, your latest, it's up at readtheline.ca. Much more unobstructed views at scottstinson.substack.com. Scott, thanks so much for joining us here. Really appreciate this.
My pleasure, Rob. Thanks for having me on.
Okay, once again, Scott Stinson, Toronto-based writer and journalist. He's got a piece up on Hockey Canada at readtheline.ca and more at his website, scottstinson.substack.com. Coming up in a moment, we'll get the latest on where things stand with Canada-U.S. trade talks ahead of what I guess is a deadline this coming Friday, August 1st, and what we're to make of what we've seen recently between the U.S. and Japan, the U.S. and Europe. On Monday, Prime Minister Mark Carney facing some questions about where things stand and what a deal might look like. That's assuming we get one with the United States. We'll have the latest on that and a few things as we wrap things up on this edition of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So we are here in the final week of July. We turn the calendar to August on Friday, which means Friday is August 1st. In the context of where things stand with Canada-U.S. trade talks, Friday is seen as a deadline. Now, previously, we'd been operating under the assumption that July 21st was a deadline, and that goes back to some of the conversations that Prime Minister Mark Carney had with U.S. President Donald Trump in the lead-up to and at the G7 summit, which, of course, was here in Alberta in Kananaskis. Since then, though, Donald Trump has threatened new tariffs to be imposed on Canada as of August 1st, so that's why that's now seen as a new deadline for getting some kind of a deal. Although keep in mind, of course, we do still have a free trade deal with the U.S., CUSMA, as we call it, CUSMA, or USMCA, as the Americans call it. But that is up for renegotiation, so we might have to go through all of this next year. In the meantime, though, it's looking increasingly likely that some of Trump's tariffs are going to be here to stay. And recently, Mark Carney has been maybe tempering expectations as to what a trade deal with the U.S. might look like. And I think just from watching how this is all going, looking at this quote-unquote trade deal with the U.S. and Japan, or now with Europe, it seems pretty clear that that's where things are headed, where the U.S. is imposing tariffs on these countries, on their trading partners, and then holding that up as a deal. So first was Japan. Japan is going to end up with a 15% base tariff. And in exchange, they're going to lower tariff barriers on U.S. imports. And supposedly, at least according to the White House, Japan will be making all kinds of investments in the United States. So the Trump administration really taking a victory lap on that. Even though, look, I mean, there doesn't seem to be a written agreement here. Japanese officials are contradicting some of this, and imposing a 15% tariff is going to increase costs on American businesses and American consumers. And that's pretty much what we've got now between the U.S. and Europe. Right? Well, the U.S. or the Trump administration comes in and says, oh, we're going to impose 25% tariffs. So you can agree to 15, and then we'll call that a deal. And same thing here. The European Union seems to be going along with that, and there's some kind of vague promises about European investments in the United States. But it's a tariff that's being imposed on U.S. businesses that import goods from Europe and, by extension, American consumers. If that ends up hurting European businesses, there's going to be less money for Europe to invest in the United States. Like, none of this is good. But I think the problem here for Canada is that this is the approach that President Trump is taking. And they seem pretty pleased with themselves. That they got these deals, they can hold them up as victories. And I think for now, too, like the stock market isn't panicking as much as we saw initially when Trump started announcing tariffs all over the place. That may change based on economic indicators, but that's calmed down for now. The U.S. economy isn't doing great, but it's keeping its head above water for the time being. I know the Federal Reserve is concerned about inflation in the U.S., and these tariffs aren't going to help, but that's not running amok just yet. So I think there's good reason to be concerned here from Canada's perspective that we are going to get stuck with some tariffs. Now, hopefully, we can still stick to the trade agreement we have with the U.S., and these tariffs won't apply to trade that takes place under that trade agreement. You look at steel and aluminum, or you look at automobiles, we could still be hit with some tariffs, and that's going to have some consequences for the Canadian economy, for sure. So where do things stand just days away from August 1st? Well, on Monday, speaking with reporters, Prime Minister Mark Carney was asked about all of this. First question here to the Prime Minister, how likely is a deal? And what do you say to Canadians or to businesses in Canada that are worried about this whole situation?
How likely is the deal by deadline? And what do you say to industry who are obviously anxious about this upcoming deadline?
Yeah, let me start with the second part of your question, which is industry, businesses, Canadians. They are anxious and they are concerned. They don't deserve the uncertainty that's been thrust upon them. They don't like it. They like resolution, but they'd also like they want the right kind of resolution. They want a deal that makes sense for Canada, that makes sense for Canadian business, for Canadian workers. And the negotiations are at an intense phase. It's a complex negotiation. You see with the various trade deals that have been agreed by other jurisdictions, European Union yesterday, Japan before, Indonesia, etc., the United Kingdom, that there are many aspects to these negotiations. We're engaged in them. But the assurance for Canadian business, for Canadians, is we will only sign a deal that's the right deal, that's a good deal for Canada. We're representing Canada. We're standing up for Canada. The United States and Canada can do many good things together. We have done that in the past. We can do more in the future, but on fair terms for our country.
Okay, one other question here for the Prime Minister. And speaking of this situation now, the U.S. and the EU, or the U.S. and Japan, what's being held up as trade deals, is that what we can expect for Canada? And is that okay?
Is it your expectation that any deal that we may be near would be somewhere in the ballpark what we just seen with the Europeans, 15% across the board? Is that acceptable?
Well, look, we have some similarities with the European Union in terms of our commercial relationships with the United States. We're one of their most important trade partners. Number two, depending on how you measure it, both imports and exports. We, like the European Union, are one of the largest investors in the United States. Our companies, our pension funds, others invest heavily in the United States. We are also partners in defense and security with the United States, as you saw with the agreements at NATO just last month. So there are similarities. There are differences. One is geographic proximity. Secondly is Europe. I'll give you one example of the difference. Europe, in that agreement yesterday, made commitments to buy American energy. Europe needs to fully get itself off Russian energy. So they're going to buy American energy to help them do that. America needs Canadian energy. You get a Canadian electricity. The only reason we run They run a trade deficit with Canada in goods and commodities is because they import around 4 million barrels a day in Canadian energy, as well as that electricity and other. So we're in a different position. Similarities, there are differences, and that is why these negotiations, whether it's with our negotiations, which is all where we're focused, but whether it's the other ones with Japan or European Union, they're different. They're tough negotiations, as they should be. As I say, we're standing up for Canada, Canadian interests. Of course, the United States is looking out. The President's looking out for the interests of American workers. There is a landing zone that's possible, but we have to get there, and we'll see what happens.
Does that landing zone include supply management in any way? Are you open to more U.S. access to the Canadian market?
Look,
for dairy?
We've been clear about supply management. We've been clear about language rights as things that are fundamental to our structure. The access, there was access negotiated and as part of, as Minister Freeland knows, as part of the existing USMCA, as they would call it, CUSMA Accord. And the question is the effectiveness of those arrangements. So look, we're going to, as I say, we'll stand up for Canada's best interests.
All right. So that was the Prime Minister speaking on Monday. We'll see what happens between now and Friday. Certainly we'll have some more follow-up on these trade talks and this whole situation on the next episode of this podcast, which we'll have for you on Friday. Don't forget as well, this week, the launch of The Line Alberta. Very much excited to be a part of this new endeavor and working with Matt Gurney and Jen Gerson at The Line as they expand their footprint. Much more at alberta.readtheline.ca. We'll have the first episode of the Line Alberta podcast. That's going to be released on Wednesday of this week and each and every Wednesday moving forward. So very excited about that. Again, alberta.readtheline.ca. More for me, of course, at our Substack, robbreakenridge.ca, included, as we talked about earlier, post on this whole controversy with this U.S. Christian singer and this whole debate around free speech and controversial bans. Or at robbreakenridge.ca. You can find this podcast at our website, also on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Amazon Music, our YouTube channel as well, Rob Breakenridge Show. Have a great week, folks. We'll talk to you soon. Take care.